Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Wade Johannes looks at movement in the corn and soybean markets. Lowell Sandell discusses weed control as we approach planting. Rick Rasby outlines cattle scoring after calving. And Ken Hellevang explains how drought can affect buildings on dry soils. Drought is easing in Nebraska with the latest U.S. drought monitor showing 8% of the state categorized in the worst form of drought. That drop is a big change from a few weeks ago when 3/4 of Nebraska held that classification. The entire state still remains in some form of drought, mainly in the D3 or extreme intensity level. It wasn't a strong start to the marketing week as gold plunged Monday to its lowest level in 2 years. Part of the broad market sell-off was due to economic news in the world's most populous country. China's economy grew 7.7% in the first quarter. That's actually above its own target of 7.5%. But below what many economists were expecting. Oil shed a few dollars from last week, while corn, soybeans, and wheat all lost ground by Monday's close. We talked with Wade Johannes from Central Valley Ag on Thursday morning. Some areas of Nebraska were experiencing snowfall then, which increased the concerns about delays in planting.
Yeah, I'd say everybody's, ready to get going, at least, get some progress going. As of Sunday night, 2% nationwide, 12% behind where we were a year ago. That sounds kind of ominous, but then when you remember, what ended up happening last year, it's still not the 1st of May, so I guess it's still early. If we start getting to the end of May and we're still talking cold and wet across the Corn Belt, then I think it's time to be concerned. Yeah,
and 0% done in Nebraska, which is a difference from last year, obviously, as well.
Absolutely.
Have you seen any market movements due to this weather? Because the eastern half of the Corn Belt, at least, is getting a lot of precipitation. They're going to be in great shape.
Yeah, they're completely healed from the drought of last year, so totally different situation from a year ago. Actually, we're going to see some flooding in places in Illinois and Iowa just due to the excessive rains here the last couple of weeks. But overall, they're going to be in good condition. I guess, if anything, too much cool, wet weather would be a bigger concern over to the east.
There's been some slight talk about acre switching or whether or not there's going to be less acres of corn. Is there anything to that yet, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, if we're getting to the end of May,
right,
then all right, then let's take a look and see if we need to switch or something. But for the most part, people stick with their rotations. And if you actually look at the numbers, corn versus beans, it's still really tough to go soybeans.
Let's talk about the big news this week. It was Monday. There was some disappointing news from China, at least from an economist standpoint. China was better than what they were expecting, but gold was hit as well. Does this mean I don't want to own gold right now? Should I just sell it all?
Well, when you think about the normal reason for owning gold, it's a hedge against inflation. And when China's numbers came out negative or not nearly as good as what they thought, it's a sign of possible deflation. So that's one of the reasons why we saw the sell-off in gold. Also some talk of Cyprus selling off gold to pay off some of its debt. So that kind of led to a sell-off, and then it led to technical selling. So yeah, it was a horrible day, which bled over to the commodity markets across the board.
Any concern there going forward, whether or not that continues to spill, or whether that continues to fall and spill into grains?
It is definitely something to keep an eye on. I mean, if gold is going down, that's probably a sign that the U.S. dollar is going to remain strong. A weaker U.S. dollar should be good for grain and or for corn and soybeans.
Right. I want to ask you about ethanol because it's at least maybe getting some breathing room here. Is that accurate to say?
It is. Actually, the spot ethanol margins are the best we've seen since 2011, so it's a welcome sigh of relief. The thing is this week's weekly ethanol grind was slower than last week, so that was a little bit puzzling. Last week we saw a nice jump in increase in production, but this week we saw a little bit of a slowdown.
Let's talk about the old crop. Let's start in corn here. Where do you think is the range here? Where's the ceiling? Where's the floor between where you're playing at?
Well, now that we had the sell-off here the last couple of weeks, it was a bigger sell-off than most people thought was possible for old crop. We're seeing a little bit of a move in basis, but I think it's going to be tough to climb over $7 futures for old crop. The old crop carryout is tight, but there's enough uncertainty and enough unknowns out there, and the carryout's comfortable enough that seeing $8 futures is probably not realistic anymore.
Barring major drought or major weather news, essentially.
Right.
Old crop soybeans, do you feel the same way there, or is there other news there?
Well, the thing that's interesting in old crop soybeans is the crush numbers. And on Monday, we saw the latest numbers for the month of March. And looking at the cumulative totals so far this year, the next 5 months, the rate needs to drop by 20%. And the largest rate drop over the last 5 months we've ever seen in the last 40 years is only 12%. So that tells me that, all right, there's still going to have to be some rationing that takes place in order for soybeans to come into line.
When you look at both new crop corn and soybeans, what's your mentality? Is it more aggressive or defensive as you try to look out to pricing that new crop?
Well, we've been preaching the message to know your numbers for quite some time, and that's where you have to start. You have to have somewhat of an idea what number makes profit for new crop corn and soybeans. And then once you know that number, look at ways of locking in profit margin. And just to use big round numbers for easy figuring, if your break even in corn is $5 a bushel and you sell the first half of your crop at $5.50, the last half of your crop, the break even drops to $4.50 a bushel. Okay, so by selling that profit margin, you're decreasing what you need on the rest of your crop just to hold things together. Now, obviously, break even is not the goal for anyone, but it's something that we need to look at in terms of managing our own risk.
Especially if you feel it can just get a little bit higher. I'll finally end with this. What do basis numbers look like in your area?
Basis has been interesting. The inverse between May and July futures has made it difficult to manage those spreads. But there's still a tight supply. The ethanol margins are really going to help. So we think basis should be supportive, if not strong, going into the summer months.
Next week, we'll look at prices and profit margins in the hog industry with the University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Plain. In its annual energy outlook, the U.S. Energy Information Administration includes a scenario that shows domestic imports of liquid fuels eliminated by 2035. The assumption is only speculative and relies on low demand and abundant U.S. supply. It sees a possibility for domestic crude oil production to reach 10 million barrels a day by 2020, sustained through 2040. This country currently produces just over 7 million barrels per day. The weakened demand would be met by factors including fuel efficiency standards and the expansion of natural gas into the market. In related news, the EIA shows a 7-cent drop in the price of gasoline from last week, with the average gallon costing now $3.54. Diesel fuel fell 4 cents per gallon. Both dropped for the 7th week in a row and are below their levels from the same time in 2012. At this point last year, spring planting was underway and Nebraska soil temperatures were in the 50s. This season is noticeably different, and as Lowell Sandell said when we talked at UNL's Havelock Farm on the northeast corner of Lincoln, delayed planting may make exceptional treatment tricky.
Weeds-wise, it's been pretty cold this year, but Surprisingly, the winter annuals are really coming along. If folks get out in their fields and look, henbit and pennycress and shepherd's purse are all flowering right now. We really encourage folks to get out with burn down applications as soon as we can, but be sure to watch the temperature a little bit. If they're really relying on glyphosate for the burn down control, we don't want to go when it's too cold with glyphosate.
Because?
You can lose some efficacy, especially if the nighttime temperatures are really dropping below 50 out there.
Why is it so important to get a great burn down before you start planting? What does the research show?
Well, yeah, research here at Havelock and out at the Scal Research Farm have shown pretty substantial yield loss, up to 10%. In some cases, by not controlling winter annual weeds by at least 2 weeks prior to planting, and that's going to be a little tough this year because we're kind of delayed with the cool temperatures. I
know last year when we talked, I think it was mid-March, you were already seeing an emergence of some summer annuals. Anything on the front there yet?
Yeah, so we have worked with glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed and glyphosate-resistant kochia in Nebraska here the last couple of years. And in some of our research plots and talking to some folks out in the state, kochia and ragweed, even though it's been cold, is up and germinating and growing right now. So folks that have dealt with those weeds in the last couple years, they're really going to want to concentrate on getting an effective burn down that probably includes 2,4-D in that burn down to get good control.
Give me an idea, last year was such a unique year, give me an idea of what caused the trouble last year, or at least the biggest trouble last year.
Well, dry conditions were tough, and in a lot of cases it was difficult to tell if we were maybe dealing with some resistance with post-emergence applications or if it was due to very difficult dry conditions out there. So, but going into 2013 here, it's even though we've gotten a little rain here, it is still kind of dry. And doing anything that we can to maximize pre-emergence performance. If in irrigated situations, it's not quite as big a deal. Hopefully we'll continue to get a little rain in the dry land situations. We'll get good activation of pre-emergence herbicides this year.
You mentioned a little bit on winter annual control, but what are the recommendations overall, both winter and summer?
Yeah, so, we've talked about this quite a bit, development of glyphosate-resistant water hemp, kochia, and giant ragweed. And it's really going to be important over the next few years for producers to basically embrace a more diversified herbicide management program to effectively manage those weeds out there. And going out with a good pre-emergence herbicide and using more of the full rate. Folks have become accustomed to maybe using lower rates or what has been called the Roundup Ready rate out there. Reading those labels and getting a full rate to give you good residual control, and then following that up with multiple modes of action post-emergence is going to be really the most effective way to manage resistance going forward.
We were talking beforehand and you mentioned that some of the research you did surrounding 2,4-D was that if you didn't get the right amounts, it wasn't as efficient.
Yeah, particularly on the giant ragweed, and this kind of applies to glyphosate-resistant mare's tail as well. But on the ragweed plots, if we didn't have 2,4-D in the burn down or as a component of the burn down prior to planting soybeans, we really struggled with giant ragweed control for the rest of the year. And for successful control of ragweed, and I think mare's tail as well, having 2,4-D as a component of that burn down, I think is going to be really critical for success here in 2013.
You can find more weed information during the planting and growing season and extension publications, including herbicide efficacy tables, online at weedscience.unl.edu. UNL Extension Beef Specialist Rick Rasby joined us last week to update calving progress in Nebraska and recommendations for record keeping during the season. This week, Rick outlines another aspect farmers and ranchers might want to look at after cows calve.
One of the things that producers might think about recording this calving season is teat and udder conformation. That's one of the traits that we typically don't take a hard look at, but it would be good to take a look at those kinds of things during calving season, or at least close after calving. In fact, the time that you would want to teat and udder score calves is somewhere around at least by 24 hours after calving. You know, you think about the importance of teat and udder conformation. You know, that's where the calf is going to get that milk, and good conformation is important. Long, pendulous kinds of udders and teats really are a detriment really to that calf. Anything that might hang fairly low, drag in the mud, that kind of contamination from a herd health standpoint is not very good. BIF, Beef Improvement Federation, has put together a standard for teat and udder scoring, a 1 to 9 system, where 1 is from a teat and udder conformation that you wouldn't want to have in your cow herd. 9 is from a teat and udder conformation standpoint is very good. As I take a look at most cow herds, at least in Nebraska, you know, teat and udder conformation can vary quite a bit, and most of them that I see probably would score somewhere into that. For teats, somewhere in that 5 to 6 range, and probably on the average, same thing for the udder conformation as well. As you take a look at teat and udder conformation, and you take a look at cattle that you're trying to score, again, you'd want to score them probably the best time to score teat and udders probably by 24 hours after calving, because that's when you really get a good indication of teat and udder conformation. The more symmetric that you have from a teat standpoint is important. Really, those teats that are maybe more balloon shape are ones that you probably want to try to avoid. From an udder conformation standpoint, those udders that have high attachment in the rear that basically hold that udder above the hock is probably pretty important as well. And so as you take a look at teat and udder conformation, small symmetric teats would be acceptable and desirable. Again, forequarters that are shaped fairly uniformly, and again hang above the hock as compared to below the hock would be pretty important as well. And so that's how you would score teat and udders. Available at the university, we also have teat and udder conformation in a form that you can basically throw this on your dashboard. It goes through the teat and udder conformation scoring system that's been approved by, or at least taken a look at by BIF. The other thing that we have, we've developed an app that you can actually download into, it's a mobile app, you can download into your iPhone or Android, and it goes through the teat and udder scoring system. It also has a guide there that if you aren't familiar with teat and udder scoring, we have teat and udder scored some cows that you can practice doing using that particular system. And then you can go out and teat and udder score your cows. It gives you the opportunity to take pictures of the teat and udders on your cow herd. You can basically compare that back to a standard that we have, and you can store that and you can save that. It's amazing that maybe if you get down the road and you need to do some culling fairly deep come this fall, maybe you have to cull not only cows that have low productivity, but going back and maybe taking a look at teat and udder conformation at calving time may be an indicator of, or maybe some of those cows you might consider culling at weaning time.
We'll link to Rick's guide for udder and teat scoring on the Market Journal website so you can see pictures of cows ranging from low marks to high. By early 2015, the 7-block Centennial Mall linking the Nebraska capital with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln will be completely refurbished. The April Nebraska Farmer explains how the state's agricultural industry will have a significant imprint on that mall. The project began about 3 years ago and today is about $1.9 million short of its $9.6 million goal. You can read about the mall renovation and how ag fits into that plan in the April Nebraska Farmer. In our continuing drought coverage, this week we look at the effect drought has on homes and buildings. North Dakota State Extension engineer Ken Hellevang recently talked with us about the lack of moisture in the soil and how it can change the organization enough to cause damage to structures.
Well, the issue is that particularly on what we call expansive soils such as clay, they will change volume as they change moisture content. They expand when they get wet and shrink, of course, when they get dry. And particularly on a foundation for a structure, if we have that clay or expansive soil that is contracting, it pulls away from that footing then, and you lose the support for the structure, or you get differing support levels for the structure, which can cause us problems.
At which level does it become a concern? I mean, at what level of drought is it a problem?
Well, the bigger the change, the more likely it's going to be a problem. And it depends on so many different factors. It's really difficult to come up with a specific percentage. But what I tell people to do is to watch for the cracks in the soil. That's an indication that soil is contracting or shrinking, and it's something that we need to be concerned about. In a home, we get concerned because the crack pulls away from the basement wall, the air gets down in there and continues to dry it out, and eventually we get down to the footing. Portion of that footing becomes unsupported, and we can actually start causing breaks in basement walls or in the footing. In an ag structure, we could still face that same kind of issue, but it's going to be probably more forgiving in that it can move a little bit more than what a home could do. But still, we need to be concerned about any significant changes in the moisture content of the soil.
Do different soils react differently to, the lack of moisture within it?
Absolutely. What we're referring to are expansive or things like clay, where it will shrink and expand a lot with the change in moisture. If we were to have a gravel base, then that doesn't really change much when we're changing the moisture content of the soil. So it is definitely soil dependent as well as moisture dependent.
So what can people do here, Ken? Is there anything that can be done to try and minimize the risk?
Well, it's to watch the symptoms, you might say. Is there any shifting taking place? Do we notice the cracks showing up? And if that's occurring, then we, of course, have an issue. What we're encouraging people to do is to try to maintain a stable soil moisture content. So it's getting moisture on the surface, letting that moisture soak down into the soil profile to create that more normal moisture content. With a home, what we recommend is they lay a soaker hose maybe a foot or two away from the wall, tip that soaker hose upside down so that the water is actually percolating into the soil, and then you do that maybe an hour or two over a several day period. Same thing would be true with ag structures. We'd be looking at some way of trying to create a uniform increase in moisture content without causing any water intrusion issues.
Cool temperatures and precipitation are slowing the warm-up for soils across the state. With what you can expect for weather over the next few days, here's UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. Yet again, another major storm moved across the Central Plains and dumped some significant snowfall once again across western Nebraska. And we've received reports of in excess of 6 inches of snow, and of course with some heavy winds there was a lot of blowing and drifting, shut the interstate down from Big Springs westward toward the Wyoming border. Farther to our east, some fairly significant rainfall across much of Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, all of those areas, at least 2 inches of moisture, and we've heard individual reports of up to 8 inches of moisture. So we've gone from excessively wet conditions to excessively wet conditions, and we're going to have some planting delay issues in this region, and it's going to take considerable time to dry out. Here in Nebraska, we welcome this moisture, and we're halfway through the month, and most locations of the state have received almost their normal allocation of precipitation for the month of April, with a few that have been over that by almost 100%. So we are basically taking away these deficits that have been accumulating since last fall, but we still have a core area of significant deficits centered in the north central Platte River Valley and in the eastern Sandhills, and we'll look for successive precipitation events to try to eliminate those deficits. Now, are we going to receive enough warm weather here to get planting underway? Well, we do have a couple of days of warmth before it cools down, but there are increasing signs in the models that very warm weather is going to start to invade the state, particularly as we get into late next weekend and the entire following week. So it does look like the conditions are starting to improve in terms of planting. So let's get right away to the models and see if we got any significant moisture events in our in our forecast, at least in the near term. And as we go to the upper air models, what we'll notice is we do have a northwest flow that is moderated and is pushing much of the colder air to our east. There is a couple little waves that are going to be moving through this system, particularly the one today is going to be moving across the Dakotas, and it looks like if anybody's going to receive precipitation, it would be extreme northern Nebraska. And right now it just looks like scattered chances of light precipitation as you farther you head south, where the drier the conditions are going to be. As we get into tomorrow, we'll see another piece of energy trying to dive down, and this is a system that's expected to start invading northern Nebraska as we get into tomorrow night, and then that will continue to push through the state all day on Monday. And by the time we get to Monday, we'll notice that this system starts to sag much farther southward. It looks like the models have been backing off on the amount of precipitation with this system, with the best chances of significant accumulations across the Dakotas, and then we'd be looking at generally a quarter to a half an inch at best across the eastern half of the state. And by the time we get to Tuesday, this system is going to shift well to our east. That's going to bring the cold air on the back side of it, so we're going to see that significant cool down once again. But it does look like that's going to be the end of significant moisture events. As we get into Wednesday, most of that cold air starts pooling across the eastern Great Lakes, and we basically are just going to be rotating energy around this, which may give us a chance of sprinkles here and there, but it doesn't look like we're going to see any widespread heavy precipitation. By the time we get to Thursday, we'll see that the ridge tries to build in, so this trough is starting to lift up toward the Great Lakes, and we'll start to see a little bit warmer conditions. And by the time we get to Friday, now the cold air shifts toward the Great Lakes, and you can see this big ridge is going to be pushing in as we get into late next weekend. That signals a very dramatic warm-up that we could easily be seeing temperatures consistently back in the 60s and 70s. As we look at the temperature forecast, we're going to be looking at some fairly warm conditions this weekend compared to what we've been accustomed to. And then we see that cool down as we get into Monday, and there may be a chance of some scattered snow, especially during the overnight hours, Sunday night into Monday morning. We see some cool conditions on Tuesday, and then a general warming trend as we get through the end of the week. If we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast, that cold air starts to shift well to our east, see the warmth building into our region, and in terms of precipitation, this dry pattern starts to establish itself very dramatically over the Central Plains.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews with Wade Johannes, Lowell Sandell, Rick Rasby, and Ken Hellevang are all available individually on the Market Journal website as part of the April 19th episode. Next week, Ron Plain will be our market analyst as we look at the hog markets, and we'll show you how soybean oil is being used in turf lawns and sports fields to reduce water use and promote a domestic product. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.